Dr. Atchison here, and we're talking about our chapter on psychological disorders. This is our first lecture in that chapter, where we're going to kind of talk about the overview of what is a psychological disorder, and we're going to talk about how diagnosticians diagnose those. So, psychological disorders are really a dysfunctional pattern of either thoughts, feelings, behaviors, or a combination of these. These not only need to have this dysfunction, but they need to be distressful and deviant as well. So we have this thing that is outside of what is typical, outside of what is comfortable, outside of what is functional. And so, again, there's that component there. So you can have actions or feelings or thoughts that might be distressful or that might be deviant. But we really need to have it that it's affecting the individual's function within their life. So these thoughts, feelings, and actions and behaviors are keeping them from being able to function in their everyday life as they would normally do. These things can be, psychological disorders are very much defined by culture and context. So different cultures are going to have different disorders. Different cultures are going to say different behaviors are disordered and some aren't. Different contexts are going to say that a behavior is disordered and a behavior is not, or a thought pattern or feelings are disordered and another is not, depending on the context. And so it's not just a black and white thing. It's not always a very clear thing between what is disordered behavior and what is not. If diagnosticians are getting really good reliability, remember reliabilities, you're getting the same answer over and over and over again. So if different diagnosticians are diagnosing the same people with the same disorders, a really good percentage is 70%. And you'll see that with some of the kind of the better understood disorders. But for some of the disorders that aren't as well understood, we see as low as 20% reliability. So again, context is going to play a big part in this, and culture is going to play a big part in this. And so we can end up with different diagnoses for the same individual from different different clinicians. Also, what's considered a psychological disorder can change over time. So it used to be in our diagnostic manual that homosexuality was considered a psychological disorder. Because our culture has changed and because our understanding of genetics and the contributing factors to homosexuality, and we know that it's not now a psychological disorder, that's been removed from the DSM. Whereas things like gender dysphoria, where your gender doesn't match, is still included in the DSM. I think that might be one that's going to change eventually. I think that maybe in the next iteration or the one after that of the DSM, that one will probably fall out. But right now it's there, and right now it's needed, in fact, to be able to have a gender reassignment surgery. So again, as our culture changes, as our understanding of these disorders change, what we consider disordered and what we consider not changes. Autism is in the DSM, and it has changed as well. What's considered on the spectrum has changed in this newest 5th edition compared to the 4th edition. I know people whose children would have been diagnosed on the autism spectrum in the 4th edition of the DSM, but are not diagnosed as autism spectrum disorder on the 5th. And so again, these things change, and the umbrella for each disorder changes. So psychopathology is the scientific study of the origin, symptoms, and development of these psychological disorders. So when we're talking about all the things that we know about these psychological disorders, how we diagnose them, where they're coming from, the different factors that are playing a role, everything that we're talking about is psychopathology, because we're getting that out of this scientific study of the origins and symptoms and development of these disorders. So there's two main approaches that we're going to look that psychopathology uses to look at psychological disorders. The first of which is the medical model, and it really looks at it is an illness of the mind. So it really looks at psychological disorders really no different than it would look at a disease or an illness of the body. So it looks at it in the exact same kind of way. Disorders can be diagnosed, labeled, there's symptoms that tend to go together. They're going to approach these psychological disorders from this idea of hey, it's no different than there's a chemical misfunction with diabetes for your body. There's a chemical dysfunction with your brain for depression or bipolar. They're going to have that same kind of view that, hey, this is something we can diagnose, and because it's something we diagnose, we can treat it. We can treat it with therapy. We can treat it with medications, these sorts of things. And this really came out of the idea and the research that was done around syphilis. So syphilis, if you let it go a long, long time, really ends up with a lot of really horrible mental symptoms at the end. A lot of psychotic features, a lot of really horrible mental effects. And once they figured out that, hey, syphilis can cause these disordered thoughts, this psychological disorder, what appeared to be a psychological disorder, that it was being caused by syphilis, it really said, hey, if we can solve this behaviors and these thoughts by treating syphilis, then maybe we can treat these other things in that same way. So it really came out of this idea that diseases and brain chemistry and all these things really can affect our moods. So when we talk about neurotransmitters being involved, all of this is going to be part of that medical model. The other approach that we have is the biopsychosocial approach, and this is no different than the biopsychosocial approach that we've been talking about all semester. It's this idea that it's a confluence of issues. So it's not just one thing. It's not just this medical model. It's not just biology that's playing a role. It's not just your genes. It's not just your brain structure, and it's not just the evolution of the species. But that these things are influenced not only by this biological constitution of the organism, but also by the psychological influences. So the amount of stress in a person's life, any traumas that they've experienced, learned helplessness, different kinds of issues with thinking, disordered thinking, in terms of it being more of a learned behavior of these thoughts, of these behaviors, these sorts of things. And not just looking at those two pieces either, because it's biopsychosocial. We're also going to look at it in the role of culture, in the role of what does this look like within this society that we're in, the role that expectations play on it. We're seeing a lot more anxiety being diagnosed, both in adults and children, and there's some argument being made that has to do with heightened expectations on children, and on adults. This idea that you have to go and do all of these things, and they need to be perfect. This heightened expectation could be contributing to this. Is one of the ideas for the increasing anxiety disorders being diagnosed. But by looking at that, by looking at the role of expectations in our society, we're looking at it from the biopsychosocial approach. We're not just saying, hey, it's just biology, it's just your genes, you're genetically predisposed for this. It's not just your stress levels, it's not just any traumas you've experienced. It's both of those things and the role of society and culture. So again, this intersecting influence between those three, and when we have this intersecting influence, we can develop a psychological disorder that all three of these things are at play when we have a psychological disorder. So because this role of culture is important, it's important to think about that there are certain syndromes and disorders that are only seen within certain cultures. And because different cultures are going to have different rules about how we behave, different rules about expectations about us, it's going to see different things as disordered versus others. So bulimia, the binging and purging, is something that we see primarily in the United States. Some other Western cultures have it as well, but it's not something that we see globally. Another example is something that's called running amok, which is a disorder in Malaysia, which is characterized by these really violent outbursts. And we have other ones that are seen in Japan with this social withdrawal. Japan is a collectivist culture, so they're going to have a really big role of the individual within that group, within that society. And so that role of the collectivist culture plays a role in what is seen as disordered. The idea, this social withdrawal then, is seen as disordered within that collectivist culture, within that collectivist view. So we know all these different things about what's disordered now. How do we classify them? We need to have a system that we can say, A, what is disordered and what is not, but what the disorder is, so that we can predict its course, we can apply appropriate treatment, and we can look into research into what's causing these different disorders. So the main tool that we have in psychology and psychiatry, and psychiatry is kind of the medical view of this. So psychology would be more therapy, where psychiatry is going to be, you go through medical school to get a psychiatry degree. But both of them are using, and other diagnosticians as well, are using the DSM, which stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We're on the 5th edition of the DSM. Remember, I say these things change over time. That's why we're on the 5th edition. We need to continually update it to be reflective of our culture, to be reflective of our environment and what's going on and what we're considering disordered now versus another time. So here are some criterion for major depressive disorder. It says and persistent depressive disorder. I cut that piece off of the image. So this is just major depressive disorder. And so it's talking about different symptoms that need to be present. And again, this is when 5 or more of the 9 symptoms. You don't need to have all of these. But things like depressed mood, loss of interest and pleasure, change in weight or appetite, insomnia or hypersomnia, so not sleeping or sleeping too much. We can see psychomotor retardation or agitation, so some kind of physical differences based on this depression, loss of energy and fatigue, worthlessness, guilt, impaired concentration or indecisiveness, thoughts of death or suicidal ideation. All of these are symptoms of major depressive disorder. And again, to be characterized as having this diagnosis, you have to have 5 or more. And so these are examples of the kinds of information the DSM is providing. The DSM is more than just a list of symptoms. The DSM actually has 5 different axes that it looks at for a diagnostic. It doesn't want to just look at just a clinical syndrome. It wants to look at kind of the whole person. So it a little bit more takes a biopsychosocial approach because it looks at the context as well. So the 5 axes it looks at, there's whether it's a clinical syndrome, whether there's any personality disorder or intellectual disabilities. The third axis looks at medical conditions, so other health issues that could impact the clinical diagnoses. It also looks on the 4th axis about environmental problems that could exacerbate the issue. So homelessness would go on the 4th axis. And the 5th axis is about functioning. So I used to be a mental health caseworker, and the first axis is the one that we all think about when we talk about diagnostics and diagnosing people. We're like, okay, what's your diagnosis? But a lot of times you would get almost more information by looking at the other 4 axes, because you could say, okay, well, if someone just has a diagnosis on one, but then there's nothing else, kind of no red flags on any of the other axes, then you know what you're dealing with. You can say, okay, well, we're just going to address kind of symptomology, these sorts of things with this individual. most of the people that I worked with, in fact, all the people that I worked with, actually had to be low functioning. So they actually had to have really low GAF scores, which is the Global Assessment of Functioning, on that fifth axis. And so my clients had both issues on axis 1 and axis 5. They also had to have issues on axis 4. They had to be low income as well. So they had to have all three of those to even be kind of in my client pool. But you would find out information about the person that way, okay? Whether they were homeless, whether they had access to income, so whether they had a job or whether they didn't have a job or whether they were on disability. These sorts of things would be information that was there. Were these things also further being exacerbated by health issues on axis 3? And were there other issues that were going to make it harder to work on these other 4 axes with the individual that would maybe come out of a personality disorder or an intellectual disability? And those would have been on axis 2. So you really get a better idea of the individual by looking at this 5-axis diagnosis. It's not just what's your clinical diagnosis, which is just really one part of this 5-part look at the individual. So, of course, nothing is perfect. So we have lots of criticisms for the DSM. And so previous versions of the DSM, and this one's going to be included in that, have been criticized for really kind of casting a really wide net as what's considered normal versus disorder. So kind of behaviors that might be perceived as actually normal can come up as diagnoses. And that's a real issue. We'll talk about labeling in a second and how that can be harmful to individuals. And so when you're taking a normal behavior or normal situation and diagnosing it as disordered, that can be problematic. There's also really these arbitrary cutoffs between when there is a disorder and when there's not, or seemingly arbitrary. You got to draw a line somewhere, and the diagnostic manual is literally, that's its job, is to draw a line between disordered and not disordered. But sometimes those things can feel very arbitrary. And again, using the autism spectrum disorder as an example, that line changed between the DSM-4 and the DSM-5. And so families and individuals that were getting services for an autism spectrum disorder diagnoses under the DSM-4 lost those services when we switched to the DSM-5. And obviously there was a lot of outcry about that. These were still people that still had things going on in their lives that still needed support and still needed help, but that change of diagnoses changed what they were able to get. There's a gender bias in the DSM is one of the criticisms for it, which is not really surprising given that we do have a lot of gender bias in our culture as a whole, that we would see that within the DSM-5 as well. And there's also the issue of, again, the lack of sensitivity to differences within our cultures, within this Western kind of larger culture, that there are differences on what would be considered disorder and what's not. And so again, people may be coming up as disordered because of this gender bias or because of this lack of sensitivity to the cultural diversity. Whereas really they maybe don't have a disorder, but because of these biases, it's coming up as disordered. We got to diagnose people so that we can treat them, but there's obviously problems in doing so. Labels can really bias perceptions about people. Saying that they have a mental disorder has a lot of stigma attached to it. The National Alliance for the Mentally Ill is an organization that is for and of people with mental illness. And one of their campaigns that they're doing is living stigma-free, that saying that this is not any different kind of than having any other kind of health disorder. And so to try and get rid of that and kind of and be more outward with what these things look like and what people with mental illness look like, because what the media portrays as mental illness and what reality of mental illness are very, very different. And so this idea that to live stigma-free can kind of work against these biases on people with mental illness. Again, these can be arbitrary just because of the criticisms of the DSM. We can have somebody that's under the net of disordered who really probably shouldn't be, or vice versa, who's not in the net of disordered and should be. And so this can, again, cause problems with judgments. Labels can really serve as a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're told you're depressed, you're going to be more depressed. It's depressing to hear that you're depressed. And so, again, we can have this self-fulfilling prophecy of, oh, well, I'm depressed, so that explains this, and kind of falling into that state of mind. And again, this stigmatizing people and adding to stereotypes. The dialogue that we have in this country about mental illness is really terrible. It is not supportive. And again, these labels enable that. By labeling these disorders, it does create situations where people can be stigmatized. It does create situations where we can further stereotypes. And it does not help us address how to handle things like mental illness as a culture and as a society when we look at this group of people under a view of a stereotype or under a view of a stigma. Okay, well, that ends this lecture on psychological disorders and diagnoses. The next lectures, we'll talk about different kinds of disorders. So we'll have a lecture on anxiety, we'll have a lecture on mood disorders, and we'll have a lecture on psychotic disorders. Thanks.